All right, hello and welcome to this episode. My name is Matt Cotty, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the founder of Restored Minds. And so on this episode, I want to talk about OCD and addiction, and I want to talk about another concept called tolerance. And so this is going to, play directly off our last episode where we talk about the similarities of OCD and addiction, right, with those four components, and how when we're treating someone or working with someone who has OCD as well as struggles with some kind of dependency, right, or chemical dependency, it's important that we obviously, we need to be in a sober mind in order to effectively do the treatment, right? But I want to talk about another concept that really plays into this, right, and it's the idea of tolerance. Now, tolerance is really just our body's ability to kind of acclimate, right? And ultimately, when we build tolerance for something, what happens is that the amount that we initially, whatever it was that we did, right? So let's say we're building tolerance to caffeine, right? If I drink a cup of coffee and I've never had caffeine before, well, my body's going to experience, a rush, right? And that first time we drink coffee, right, it's going to experience really what it's doing is a certain high, right? And then what happens is that my body builds tolerance to that level. And so in order to achieve that same level of that same rush, I would need to drink more coffee, right, to get to that level, right? And so because my body builds tolerance, right? What we, the word tolerate, right? What we're able to kind of, exist with, so to speak. And when it comes to tolerance plays a huge role in OCD and addiction as well, right? And in the same way with coffee, right, you can interchange that with really anything that people get addicted to, right? So things like risk tolerance, right? And that's where, people that become addicted to, gambling, let's say, well, the risk tolerance seems to go up, which is why the problem gets more and more extreme because the losses are more severe, right? When someone struggles with gambling addiction, because the risk tolerance goes up, right? In many ways, with gambling addiction, that is actually what the addiction is that feeling of putting it on the line, right? It's not actually winning, right? In some cases it's that dopamine of winning, but really that adrenaline rush of, the risk. As well as things like, any kind of chemicals, right? So it started with alcohol, right? It started as, one or two drinks, to reach that same level or internal state, then becomes 3 to 4, then becomes 5 to 6, and then becomes, now we're switching to harder alcohols. And it just kind of builds and builds and builds because we build tolerance to the event or the substance, right? And in the same way, this happens with compulsive behaviors, right? That's why someone who struggles with, let's say, contamination, OCD, when they wash their hands, right, it may start off as just a quick little rinse, like a quick little extra rinse when those thoughts first happen, right? What if I get contaminated? What if I get this disease? So a quick little rinse is able to satisfy that. But what happens is again, we build tolerance. So what started as a quick little rinse then becomes washing for a few more minutes, becomes washing with, maybe a heavier soap, right? And then all of a sudden is like hotter water until the person eventually, right, is washing for multiple hours or taking 3-hour showers or washing to the point where their hands are, blistered, right, and cracked because they've just overwashed them. And this is what happens with tolerance, right, is that we keep, and the reason tolerance exists is because we're trying to achieve an internal state, right, with some kind of usually external thing, whether it is something we're putting in our body or some kind of situation, right, like washing our hands, gambling, shopping, right, and even in sex and stuff like that, right, we're trying to shift our internal state, and in order to shift our internal state, we use these items, right, or these situations, these scenarios, and what happens is that in order to shift our state to the level that we want it, we just have to use more and more and more and more, and that's how tolerance essentially develops. And the problem is that it builds to the point where it becomes unsustainable. right? And it becomes unmanageable, and it ultimately takes over. And that's what happens with OCD. That's also what happens with addiction. And generally speaking, it when it gets to the point where it's unmanageable is when people are finally seeking help. And so I wanted to just talk about, to piggyback off the last episode when we talk about the similarities of OCD and addiction, one of the concepts that I forgot to talk about was the idea of tolerance and how that works with both. And realizing that if you're chasing that internal shift and you're chasing it in the short term, what will happen is whatever you use to get that shift, right? So, and when I talk about shift, I'm talking about shifting our internal state, right? So if we are feeling depressed and we want to feel good immediately, well, yeah, when there are things we can do that might cause that shift to happen temporarily, right? The problem is that if we don't actually learn to navigate and emotionally regulate ourselves, and we're using something to do that, then it could be anything. It could be shopping, right? It could be, going on online dating sites and just talking with people. And, how many people, I think about with social media even, right? How many people post stuff and are just looking for those likes, right? Those subscribes, right? Whatever it is, those follows, because those cause that internal validation to happen. And this is how people get addicted to things like social media, right? Because if you don't feel good about yourself, right, and you're wanting that external validation to feel good internally, this is a really good example. So let's just use it. When I post a post online, let's say it's funny, and let's say 10 people comment and like it and tell me I'm funny, that makes me feel good, right? And that shift happens, right? Very quickly. We notice the shift, right? It feels good, right? That dopamine hit happens in our brain. And then what happens is that then 10 is not enough though, right? So the next post we have, it needs to be funny. And, because we have that baseline now, right? Let's say it took 10 likes for us to feel validated. Well, we do our next post and only 9 people like it. It's like, oh man, I failed, right? And we start to get down on ourselves. But then once we get 15, then it's like, okay, now that's good, right? And then it grows and it grows and it grows. And then my posts have to be more extreme to get more likes and more, or whatever. And all of a sudden, you're doing things you never realized you'd ever do because you're chasing that internal shift, right? And that really is what most addiction, when it comes down to, is about. It's about that internal shift, right? And the same with OCD, right? The difference with OCD is that we get locked in that loop and it just spirals out of control. And with that said, when we build tolerance to something, what happens is we're always going to have to do more, right, to get that internal shift. And eventually that's going to become unmanageable. And that's why obviously these things work in the short term, right? It's important to acknowledge that, right? Compulsions work in the short term, or else we wouldn't do them, right? Drugs or other things that people use that become addicted to, right? They work to achieve whatever you wanted them to achieve in the short term, but over the long term, they're a terrible solution for the most part, right? And what happens is when you're choosing your short-term comfort over your long-term well-being, it's going to go into a direction that's going to become unmanageable. And that's why, at Restored Minds, right, it's all about, we always promote the idea of choosing our long-term health over our short-term comfort, right? And when you can do that consistently, right, you can learn to navigate the short-term disruptions, right, the short-term uncomfortable feelings, and navigate them in healthy ways that are going to align with your long-term goals. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully that you kind of see how tolerance works, and when it comes to addiction and OCD, and why it's so important that we understand that, because if we understand how tolerance works, we can start to begin to see the behaviors we're doing that we're building tolerance to that are ultimately not going to serve us in the long term. And so, yeah, with that said, that's really kind of what I wanted to cover with the whole idea of OCD, addiction, and tolerance. If you found this helpful, if you're something you struggle with, if you're dealing with OCD, anxiety, and psychological stress, we have resources over at restoredminds.com. In fact, there's some links right down in the notes here that will direct you over to free downloads, meditation, as well as we have a webinar, right, that we run, as well as our other resources like our live Zoom calls that we do with our community and other premium trainings. So thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us today. I hope you found this helpful. Also, we really appreciate your support by liking, subscribing, and sharing, and commenting. Let us know if there's any kind of episodes you want us to create in the future that might help you. And with that said, hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I will see you in the next episode. Take care.
Hey there, Matt here, and thank you for watching that video. And if you're struggling with stress and anxiety, I just want to let you know that I have a free 7-minute meditation that I'd like to give to you. You can just click the link right down in the notes to get instant access, and we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing to our channel. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you soon.